Brad, what's going on, man? Welcome to the Dad Edge.
Hey, Larry, it's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's good to have you. So you are the master of change, is that correct?
I wrote a book, but there's no "the" in the
There's no
title.
the.
It's just Master of Change. The title's actually got a lot of paradox to it. It's almost like a Zen koan or a riddle because you can't really master change, right? Because change is always changing. It's always in flux. So it's like we wanna grab a hold of this thing and master of it, but this thing is not. You can't grab a hold of it. So I'm certainly not the master. If any listeners have figured it out, you call me up and make me a wealthy man.
I know your one of your books out there, The Practice of Groundedness, and now we're talking about Master of Change. I'm so curious, how did you even get involved in work like this?
Well, it's been a somewhat circuitous path for me. My formal education was in economics and psychology. I went to go work for one of the big management consulting firms. Quickly decided that while I was learning a lot, it probably wasn't how I wanted to spend my life and my career. I went back to school. I studied public health in graduate school. Quickly became less interested in how to treat disease and more interested in what it means to really flourish and to thrive. I've always been an athlete, so I've always been obsessed with performance. My first book is Peak Performance. It's really about just that, like how to perform at one's best in a sustainable way. But then I realized that like the goal of life isn't just to perform. The goal of life is to find meaning and fulfillment and to become not just better, but stronger and kinder and wiser. And over the last couple of years, my writing has shifted more into what I call excellence, which is similar to performance, but it's all about how do you feel good and do good over the long haul. And groundedness is really what's the foundation of the mountain. And then master of change speaks to, well, there's all sorts of weather that blows when you're climbing, whatever mountain it is that you're climbing, and how do you navigate the changing weather? And that's the story in a nutshell.
Well, you know what? I didn't expect to start with groundedness, but I think based on what you just said, we should probably give the audience just that foundation of what that looks like.
Right. So the way that I think about what it means to be grounded is if you think about a mountain, right, everyone immediately thinks about the peak. Or if you're in the presence of a big mountain, people glance up, they look at the peak because it's way up in the sky. And if it's a really prominent mountain, maybe you take some note of the slope of it, but no one ever like admires the base of a mountain, right? But without a solid base, there is no mountain. So I think that we're the same. We spend a lot of time focused on like the bright and shiny objects up top, and there's nothing wrong with those things. But we don't spend enough time thinking about like, well, what's the foundation? What's going to hold us to the ground? And groundedness is really just about that. How do you develop a really solid foundation in your life? I spent some time researching this. The key principles are accepting reality, being present for what's happening in front of you, being patient, realizing that there's no such thing as an overnight breakthrough, cultivating vulnerability to build trust, not only with others, but to genuinely trust yourself, the power of deep community and brotherhood or sisterhood and belonging. And those are the principles that I believe like lead to that foundation of groundedness, but all too easily get overlooked in the hustle and bustle of life.
Talk to me a little bit about the community piece. Most men, there's that quote. Most men live quiet lives of desperation and isolation, right? Where we are physically surrounded by people all day, but there's very few people that we actually let into our lives, and vice versa. I've never, maybe it's ego, maybe it's pride, maybe we don't want to show our cards. I'm not really sure, but there is tremendous power in community and tribe. But a lot of people don't, they don't view it that way if they're on the outside of it.
That's right. And it's a real crisis. Deaths of despair, which are qualified as death by suicide, substance use disorder, overdose, so on and so forth, impact men at a rate of somewhere between 3 to 4 times more than women. There's a loneliness epidemic that is impacting both genders, but there's a lot of research that shows it impacts men the worst. So it is a real problem. And I don't have any quick solutions. I think part of the issue is that for so long, the kind of model masculinity was stuff it all inside, or like swallow your pain and suffering, or your challenges, your insecurities, your doubts. And being strong meant being really buttoned up, and not expressing those things. Yet everything that we know about how to forge close relationships and community comes from being vulnerable with one another. So these two things are kind of at odds with each other, right? The old school model of being a tough guy and not opening up really becomes a detriment to building close bonds and in close community. Just a couple of weeks ago, there was this beautiful interview before the Colorado football game where Michael Irving, former NFL wide receiver for the Cowboys, was talking to Deion Sanders, who's now the coach of University of Colorado Buffaloes and was
Right.
a star in his own right. And Irving was just talking about how he was going through a real tough time when he retired from football, and how Deion was there for him, and how he expressed to Deion the depression he was feeling with the transition out of sport and the hopelessness and the what he's he going to do next. And the two of these guys just broke down crying on the air about their friendship and just hugged each other, said like life is hard, like that's why I'm here. And to me, like that is the essence of how you form community and bonds. But that doesn't happen if Michael Irving doesn't open up to Dion about what he was really feeling. So I think it starts with opening up, and it sounds so cliche, but vulnerability really is the conduit to trust and intimacy, and not just in romantic relationships, but in friendship as well.
And don't you think, I mean, there's a true need for men to contribute, six basic human needs: certainty, uncertainty, love, community, growth, contribution. And I would say even for men that that contribution piece is so important to us. But in order to do that, another man, has to ask for help where we can then contribute to his life, right? And as soon as somebody opens up, tells us about something that's going on, it's like our immediate response is like, how can I help? Like, what can I do? Like, and those types of things. I had a text from one of my business partners today who tragically lost his 19-year-old daughter back in February in a car accident. And it was,
Mm.
I've never seen anybody I know walk through such hell as he has. And here we are. It's been several, we're recording this in the beginning of October, and I just reached out to him this morning over text. I talk to him almost every day. I'm like, hey man, how's your morning? Just kind of like that. I mean, and there's been an ebb and a flow for his emotions around this. Some days are good and he never talks about it, and you think everything's fine, and then there's some days that are really hard. And he just I won't share the detail, but he just completely opened up about just where his head was at today. I had no idea. He said today was like literally the worst day that he has experienced. The pain of how much he misses his daughter is literally physically, mentally, emotionally, like to use this words, unbearable. Like right now, he's like, I haven't gotten out of bed today. And dude, there is not one part of me. Yeah, it sounds rough, man. Like, yeah, of course, like every part of me is like, dude, do you need to talk? Like, I'm like, what can I do? How can I best support you, man? Like, thanks for telling me these things, right? It's like all I want to do is give, contribute. And I feel somewhat honored that the guy feels comfortable enough to tell me this stuff. But most men walking the planet, like they don't have some of these friendships like this, or they have acquaintances, or they may have friendships, but they don't have the deep connected friendships where it's more like that tribe mentality, or like you said, the community that people so desperately need. What do you think is the biggest roadblock for someone to be vulnerable and authentic? Do you think it's just that label of like, well, if I'm vulnerable, that means I'm weak? Or what do you think it is?
No, I think that it is. You have to face your fears to be vulnerable, and you have to go to that place where you fully acknowledge that you are feeling broken, or that the pain and suffering that you're in is unbearable. That you can't do this alone. Like asking for help is hard, and this is hardwired into the DNA of men. Way back, our prehistoric ancestors, the primates that we came from, like the way that men attracted mates was by being the alpha, by being really tough. And it's hard to unwind millennia of genetic inheritance in DNA, but we're no longer living on the savannah as apes. We're now warm-blooded humans with soft skin and big hearts, and to be strong in today's world is different than it was a million years ago. But it's got to be a learned behavior, and I think that there needs to be more men role modeling that sort of behavior. And men might never be as relational as women, and that's okay. But I think that we can strive to be more relational, and strive to be closer together. Um, you see that it is doable in the army, and men that go to war together. They whether they like it or not, they have to face fears together, and they have to be raw and uncut. Um, and there's a whole lot of bonding that happens in those situations. Sebastian Junger has done some really interesting work on this, where when men come back from war, they often feel lonely, and while they're glad to be off the battlefield, they miss that brotherhood in civilian life. And there's no reason that we should need to go to war to feel brotherhood. We should be able to create it in our own community. So it's a long-winded way of saying I don't think there are many great role models for it. I think some of it is working kind of against our genetic inheritance, or there's an evolutionary mismatch. Chest thumping made sense a long time ago, but it doesn't now. We've yet to fully outgrow that. Um, and I think it's a process, but I think that there are examples, and I think it does happen more than it used to, like the profound example that you just gave with you and your business partner. But
Yeah,
I'd encourage men that are listening to like realize that performative vulnerability is bullshit, and like you see a ton of that on social media. But like the real thing should feel uncomfortable. Like it should feel icky. It should make you feel um yeah, uncomfortable. And like that's when you're doing it right, and you kind of have to surrender and be like, I can't figure this out, man. I need your help. Or when I went through this divorce or this depression or this layoff or whatever it was, like part of being vulnerable makes you revisit those things. And it's not to say that every day and every relationship has to turn into a therapy session, but I think if there's an urge to go there and you swallow that urge because you think it's tough to, or because you don't want to face the discomfort, um, I would encourage you to play around with actually following that urge and going there and letting people in, because we often think that you have to really trust someone to be close to them, but it is often like the other way around, that like the way that we develop closeness is by being vulnerable, um, versus already having that relationship, because relationships, like they're not switches, they develop over time, and the more vulnerable we can be along the way, the stronger those bonds are.
that is insanely true. I want to ask you one more question about vulnerability since we're really on this topic. For married men, you're married, I'm married. Uh, the interesting thing is even though I've been married for 20 years, my wife is my best friend. Like she is just the woman I do life with. Like literally, I just love spending time with her, and we have great conversation. We're yes, we're husband and wife. We're also really good friends. I find that as she passes my office, and she's probably hearing this, I find that if I the fear of being vulnerable with my wife is actually greater than one of my best friends.
Yeah,
It's
I hear
just
that.
yeah,
I hear that.
in your opinion, why do you think that? And I think a lot of guys would agree with that. Why do you think that is?
I think we want to have our shit together.
Yeah,
Um, I've learned that, and I too love my wife to death, and so fortunate we have a very solid relationship. I've learned that when I'm not an ideal husband or not an ideal father, it's generally because I'm holding on to something. And if I just say, like, I'm feeling really overwhelmed now, or like, I've got a lot of doubt, I'm feeling really insecure right now, uh, then I'm a much better spouse, partner, husband, and father. So I've learned to just do it out of not getting into tiffs with my wife or not snapping and being short on my kids. Because, like, come on, so often the reason for an argument or a fight or short tempered parenting, it's not the actual thing that's happening in the moment. It's that you're feeling
100%.
overwhelmed about something else. And it takes a lot of vulnerability to ask your wife for help or just to say, like, I'm stressed and overwhelmed, just naming it, and then get on doing the dishes. But the more that you hold on to that stuff, the more it manifests in other ways. But I think it just comes from wanting to have your stuff together, which is a completely valid thing. um but our wives are strong and powerful too, and like they can create space and hold it for us, and we have to give them a chance to when we're not feeling well.
I agree with that. I think a lot of us view, our marriages as like, well, I don't want her to think I don't have my stuff together. Maybe I come across as weak. Like I'm supposed to be her man, her protector, her, leader. What if she thinks I can't handle it? What I have found is doing this work for, I think there's a fine line because I don't think any woman wants like a wet, weeping, estrogenic sponge who's constantly negative, who's constantly breaking down. But I think any
I don't
woman
think
is,
that's women either. I think that's men too. I think that like
yeah,
that person probably needs to work through their own problems before they can be in a relationship.
yeah, I agree with that. But I also think that there is an incredible there's an incredible level of intimacy and connection that happens when you decide to, take that step and say some of the things out loud that maybe you're dealing with, you're trying to hold back, or you're quote unquote trying to protect her from, right? And I think even in a masculine way, so like for instance, and I'd love to get your opinion on this because we're going to talk a little bit about masculinity. But when I go to share with my wife something that is personal to me or something I'm struggling with, like the way I do it is not in a way of like, oh my gosh, the world is crumbling, or anything like that. I'll just be like, hey, can we talk for a minute? Cause I just want to share a few things that are just rattling around in my head right now. And I just want to bounce some things off you, let you know where I'm at, but I also want to hear your input. And I'll just sit down and be like, all right, here's where I'm at. Here's what's going on. This, and this, and and I'll explain things along the way, but I do it in a way where it's more like, hey, I'm laying this out and I'm saying all this stuff out loud. I'd love to get your input or what you think. And I don't do it in a way where like I feel like the skies are falling, right?
Hmm.
So, but what's your take on how to do that best?
I think it depends on the relationship and it depends on who you are and who your partner is. So I think it's just to be authentic. And I think sometimes if the sky is falling, it's okay to acknowledge that it feels like that's happening. If that's happening every day, again, like you probably, should seek help from a therapist or some professional. Um, but I think that so many of the things, like there's a difference between the sky falling and frustration about something that happened at work or anxiety about whether or not you're going to get a promotion. So on and so forth. I mean, an example that I just went through is our older one started kindergarten, and for whatever reason, man, I was just feeling like it's just so much bigger than his preschool, right? Where you go to drop him off, and just feeling like a lot of anxiety about school shootings and violence that can happen. Knowing with my rational mind that the percentage odds of it are like, akin to getting hit by lightning, if not significantly lower. But it was on my mind a lot, and I just named it for my wife, and I said, like, I don't expect you to do anything or fix this. Like, I just want you to know, like, it's really hard for me right now, and I'm feeling a lot of angst about this. And we ultimately had a really good conversation just about uncertainty in the world that we live in and the life that we want for our kids and what we long for and what we hope, and kind of like accepting the tragedy of so much that's broken with our world, but also the beauty of like loving and caring about a kid so deeply. And I think that conversation brought us closer together in that moment. Whereas if I would have held on to that, it doesn't do me any good. And I miss an opportunity to really connect with my wife.
Yeah, I think when we hold things back, and especially if we know what those things are, right? But if they don't know what those things are, we're like, oh, I'm good, I'm fine, or whatever. I think sometimes, depending on the relationship dynamics, like the woman can be like, is there something wrong with me? Is there something wrong with
Hmm.
us? Right. Cause like I'm sh-
why are you being isolate, or why are you isolating, or like why are you checking out? Why are you kind of giving like the silent treatment?
yeah.
And you think you're doing her a favor by like not burdening her with what's on your mind, but she's reading it as like you self-isolating, and it's just a vicious cycle.
Yeah, and you're not bringing me in. It's almost like trust is not really there. It's like, well, wait a second, you don't trust that I can't handle whatever it is you're going through. That's kind of insulting.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And I think sometimes it is just like a lot more, I don't want to use the word trivial because none of this stuff is trivial, but it's a lot less serious. I just had this book come out, and like I was somewhat, stressful time during launch and wanting to do right by my publisher. And there's all these bestseller lists. And I was just feeling like some nerves and a little short and irritated. And it's just like telling my wife, like, I'm feeling a little bit irritated and, maybe not as discerning as I always am in this stretch. And I want you to know, like, it has nothing to do with you or the kids. Like, I'm just stressing because it's hard putting out a book in the world, and I'm trying to sell this book, and just naming that and not using it as an excuse to check out, not using it as an excuse for poor behavior, but just simply saying like, hey, like if I am a little bit in my head, it's not you, it's because I'm a little stressed right now.
sure.
And that's it. And my wife's like, yeah, I get it. Of course you are. Boom, like on with dinner or whatever next we had planned. Not that big of a deal. But if we hold those things in, they compound and they build up and they build up, and then it is a big deal.
Well, and plus, like, I mean, that even, I know your kids are little. I have four boys that are 17, 15, 9, and 7. And, if I'm holding on to stress, like right now, I have a manuscript that's due, actually almost right when this podcast is coming out. Um, November 15th, I have a manuscript due. And so I feel really under the gun, but if I simply communicate those things, like if I'm feeling pressure, if they feel tension or whatever, and they're like, like, did I do something wrong, Dad? Or they don't ask like that. But if I just simply communicate like, hey, sorry guys, I know I'm a little off. I probably come across a little tense. I'm just really under the gun with this deadline and feeling lots of pressure, lots of stress, but it has nothing to do with you guys. Like you can literally feel like the oxygen being put back into the room when you just simply communicate to the people you care about most that like, hey, this is what's on my radar right now. It really doesn't have anything to do with you guys whatsoever, but it's just sort of there. It really brings them into like, oh, okay, cool. Right.
And it role models for them that dad can still be my superhero. And a part of having everything together is occasionally not having everything together and being okay naming that.
100%. And I think, yeah, because when you model those things, like you're not teaching, young boys or daughters for that matter to just stuff it down, don't feel it, I'm fine, leave me alone, whatever. That doesn't do well for any of us.
Yeah.
Um, I'd really like to start talking about, master of change. So, but I think where I'd really like to start with master of change is when you just say that word out loud, change, that could be a really triggering thing for a lot of people. Like people just simply, they don't really like change, and it scares us to some degree. But what is it about change and I guess the human experience that we don't like it, we resist it, we don't want it to happen maybe, or if we do, we want to control it, right? Or something.
Yeah. So in the research literature, there's this term homeostasis
Sure.
that a lot of listeners have probably heard of. And it essentially is 500 years old. The term itself was coined in 1865, but the concept is like way back 15, 1600s, the beginning of empirical science. And it describes change as a cycle of order or stability, then disorder or change, chaos, instability, and back to order. And inherent to homeostasis is that change is bad. Anything that takes us out of stability is bad. And therefore, as you said, we should resist it, avoid it. And if we're forced to deal with it, the goal is to get back to order as fast as possible. And this was the cultural underpinning of how we think about change for millennia. Yet, about 10, 15 years ago, the research community stepped back and they said, actually, that's not really an accurate model for how change works in people that are really strong and gritty and flourish. And they describe change 2.0, is an order, disorder, reorder. So yes, we crave stability, but that stability is somewhere new. It's constantly updating itself. And they call this allostasis. And I think the etymology, the origin of these two words, really tells the whole story. So homeostasis comes from the Latin root homo, which means same, and stasis, which means standing. So it argues that we achieve stability by staying the same. Allostasis comes from the root allo, which means change, and then stasis, which means standing. So it says that we achieve stability through change. And it has this beautiful double meaning, which is that we can be stable through change. And the way to do it is through change, or by changing, at least to some extent. So it's a long-winded answer to your question. I think that for the longest time, we grew up homeostasis, like change is abnormal. We want stability. And that stability ought to be wherever we were. And I think just having this new language and this new idea and this new concept to say, yeah, like we do want stability, but that stability is always somewhere new. It's a moving target. And it's just the empirical reality of how life works. Like nothing's ever the same. Uh, Aging comes for all of us. This is a podcast for dads. Marriage, things are different after you get married. If you go through a divorce, things are different after that. Having kids, like there's no getting back to where you were. So why should we try? And there's no resisting change. It's futile. Research shows that the average adult goes through 35 major life changes,
My
about
gosh.
one every 18 months. Yet we think that change is the exception, and we're told that it's something that happens to us. And in the book, I argue like, no, it's just the ongoing nature of life. Like to fear change is to fear life. Because think about it, right? Like we're all aging. We're all going to experience illness at some point or injury. Um, Dads, kids are going to eventually, hopefully, if they thrive, move out of the house. That's going to be a huge change. Uh, we're going to have good things happen in work and bad things, successes and failures. Our marriage changes over time. So, like, we might move geographies. So, there's all of these things that do happen. And if we fight against them or resist them or push against them, we generally end up suffering. Whereas if we can accept them and work with them, take productive action in their midst, we do better and we feel better.
So, I mean, I've never heard that. That is insanely clear. It makes so much sense when you lay it out like that.
Yeah, just
But
order, disorder, order,
right.
disorder, reorder. And change is not something that is a one off event, it's the ongoing nature of reality. And I'm only interjecting because I think this is such an important point and idea is we are always somewhere in a cycle of order, disorder, reorder. And that's okay. That's not a problem. That's just life.
What's so interesting is that I can see like these seasons happening, right? Like some of the things, and I'll just share with you some of the things that I've gone through. It might help the audience a little bit. So I would say one of the most apparent things that I've gone through, like one of my non-negotiables is fitness. So
Hmm.
I train every day. It is like my outlet. It is like where I have peace, I have harmony, I feel better, endorphins, and the whole nine yards, right? And I have a very regimented things of what I do. I do cardio every day, I do weights every day, and all that other stuff. Um, about 8 weeks ago, I injured my knee pretty bad in a workout, and I have not been the same since. I actually, as you and I are speaking, I'm going to go see an orthopedic surgeon on Friday
Hmm.
because I just need to figure out why in the heck this thing is not healing. But dude, it has been so frustrating for me. And I have been so stressed out over it because, and I keep saying the same thing. I'm just like, I just want to be able to do what I was doing. Like, period. Like, I just want to go back to when I was training like I was. Like, that was my happy place. And I've been fighting it and fighting it and fighting it. And it wasn't until literally I'm having this conversation with you today. I was literally in the gym today. And instead of doing a run, I got on the elliptical. It was the first cardio I've done in 8 weeks. And I was like, I'm just going to try this. I don't want to do it because it's different. Like, it's not as intense as running. Like, I'm all these stories I'm telling myself. I get on the elliptical and I was like, wow, I was like, my knee doesn't hurt at all on this thing. This is pretty cool. And I was able to do 35 minutes, no issues with my knee whatsoever. And then I trained my legs and I had to do all these different things that were for more PT to rehab the knee and all that. And it wasn't until today, 8 weeks after the whole thing happened, I was just like, you know what? For right now in this season, and maybe long term, who knows? I'm just gonna have to do things different. And I'm just gonna find a way to do it different. But I resisted it and fought it so much that it was literally driving me crazy. And but it wasn't until I'm just like, I'm just gonna have to do it different. But I allowed, it was almost like the change was external this whole time, but I had to flip this switch internally to deal with it and just be like, okay, I just have to deal with what I've got going on here. But that's been something I've been fighting with for 8 weeks.
Thanks for sharing that. I think injury in sport is a real clear example of where we often get ourselves into trouble when we resist change because we try to train through these injuries
Yes.
or we try to return too soon. And we often end up making things worse by
Yep.
doing that instead of just accepting that we're entering a period of disorder and perhaps the training on the other side is going to look a little bit different. Um, this gets to the second key construct in the book, which I call rugged flexibility. And I argue that the way to navigate these cycles of order, disorder, reorder in our lives is to be both rugged and flexible. And generally, people hear these two terms and they think of them as opposites, right? So to be rugged is to be tough, determined, durable, and to be flexible is to be soft, supple, to bend easily without breaking, to adapt. Yet, in my research and reporting on individuals that thrive throughout these seasons of change, I constantly found that they displayed both ruggedness and flexibility. And I think in your instance, how I would frame this, just from what you shared without knowing you too well, is that you could latch on and be a little bit too rugged or even rigid to your workout protocol and needing to do it and not have any flexibility and just butt your head up against a wall and be miserable, perhaps make things worse. You could have too much flexibility, which would say, I guess I just can't train anymore uh, because I'm injured. I'm just gonna like go with the flow and do what the doctors say, which is so often if you don't see a sports med doctor, just rest. But that can be hard to do, especially if training is also something you do for your mental and spiritual health. Uh, but rugged flexibility would say, well, hey, instead of defining myself as someone who runs or someone who lifts a certain way, I'm going to define myself as an athlete. Like that's the source of my ruggedness, or my real value is like physical movement, physicality. And then I'm going to be really flexible with how I apply that at different points in my life. And being a runner or running makes you fragile because an injury happens and you can't run, then it's like, well, shit, then who am I? What do I do? But being an athlete or being someone that values physical activity or physicality, that is so much more durable because injury happens and you just shift. You can still be an athlete, just not in the same way. So this rugged flexibility is really about like knowing your core values and holding on to those things tight. Those are things you don't want to let go of, but then applying them really flexibly. In your case, even if that means getting on the elliptical.
It makes so much sense. I
I
wish we
try.
would I wish we would have talked like a month ago. It would have been very helpful. What about, let me ask you this. You've got 2 kids, I've got 4.
Mhm,
Rugged flexibility as a father. I would love for
mhm.
you to maybe give us a story or an example through the lens of that one.
Yeah, I mean, in short, I want to be able to deadlift 500 pounds in front of my kids. And I also want to be able to talk openly about when I experience depression. That's it. Like, I want to be both really hard and really soft. That's the example of masculinity that I want to bring to my kids. Um, I want to embrace and not be ashamed of the physicality and the testosterone and all of the things that not all men, but many men just biologically are endowed with. And that's okay. I want to celebrate that. And I want to role model an openness and a vulnerability, like we talked about early, a caring, compassion, and a softness for my kids too. And I think that's it. I think like being too rugged in our way that we think about fatherhood or masculinity is just the tough guy, the machismo, swallow it all, so on and so forth. But I think that getting rid of the physicality or pretending that that stuff doesn't exist is can be equally is harmful. So it's not either or, it's both and I think where so much of the culture war goes wrong is it goes into this either or. You know, I'm painting in broad strokes, but on the right, you're either like a man's man and everything is biological. And on the left, you know, there's no such thing as a man and there's nothing that separates men from women. And like both of those extremes to me are so far from the truth. And I think being rugged and flexible is like being somewhere in the middle, based on who you are and what your family system is like.
Yeah, I often refer to my grandfather because he was just such an instrumental part of like my life growing up and didn't have a father, but I had him. And my grandfather was definitely like this example, and I've never heard rugged flexibility, but that is literally how he was. So he was a blue collar, quote unquote man's man, worked with his hands, really tough, but also was this incredible example to me of what an affectionate father figure was. Like he would hug me, kiss me, he would hug my grandmother, kiss my grandmother, tell her how beautiful she was, like all these different things, but yet he was tough. Like you didn't mess with him either, right? And it was like this incredible, incredible combination of what it means to be a man. And it's just incredible example growing up. But I think you're right. I think men are pretty extreme just by nature. It's either full throttle or no throttle. I'm either going to pull the car out of the garage and go 90 miles an hour, or I'm not going to leave the house at all. I'm going to go to the gym and work out for 3 hours or not go to the gym at all. And it's like we really swing on these pendulums of like, I gotta be tough and stoic and immovable. Or I'm gonna be like the other side of that, which is super soft. Like, and there, but I think we can be malleable. We can be both.
I mean, that's certainly what I argue in this book. And it's not a book about parenting or masculinity, but I've been told by so many people that, like, in disguise, it kind of is. Because I think that, like, what it means to be a man is going through a period of change. I think that most people can agree that going back to like the 1950s, quote unquote, good old days, or what some might call like patriarchy, probably isn't good. Like it's great that women are working and are empowered in ways that they weren't years ago. But I think people can equally realize that like a lot of men feel lost, and that's a real problem to reckon with. And we don't have positive normative models of what masculinity ought to be like during this period of change. I feel like there's like a big disorder cycle, uh, and as technology has replaced more blue collar work. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons for it. And I feel like now more than ever, it's important to have role models that can show like a rugged and flexible masculinity that can not throw the baby out with the bathwater and keep some of these traits, but in a way that makes sense for our modern world.
I agree, man. I agree because we truly do need both, without a doubt. So we've discussed, our perception. I think our human nature perception of what change looks like. Why we resist it, why we fight it. You made a lot of sense when stability is actually a moving target. It doesn't stay the same. Uh, I'd really love for you to share anything that as it relates to change with perhaps either marriage. So like we'll go through ebbs and flows and seasons of sometimes closeness, sometimes distance, or it could be something big that the other person is going through or whatever, or also changes with our kids. So you have little kids, right? And 4 years ago I didn't have teenagers, but now I do. And those things have changed, right? So when it comes to mastering change or being malleable when change happens, what advice do you have for fathers who are raising kids in the seasons to come? And then also for husbands in the seasons to come for marriage?
It's a great question. I'm going to come back to this notion of rugged flexibility. And I think know your sources of ruggedness. So know your core values, know the things that make you who you really are, the things that you aspire towards that are your North Stars. Uh, Example core values could be health, respect, autonomy, wisdom, compassion, strength, intellect, creativity, love. Just a few examples, right? And those are your sources of ruggedness. Like that's the ground that you stand on. And then when you go through different seasons, you just have to ask yourself, like, how am I going to apply these core values? And that's going to change over time. So the values themselves don't change. That's what makes you who you are. But how you apply them is going to look very different based on what's going on around you. An example of this that is not so much exactly like to your point about fatherhood and kids, but I think really gets to this point is the tennis player Roger Federer. So one of the greatest tennis players of all time, known not only for his dominance in the sport, but also for his longevity. I mean, he's really the first athlete, even before Tom Brady, that like took a sport where normally young guys crush and just dominated into his late 30s. But what a lot of people overlook about Federer is between the ages of 33 and 36, he didn't win a single big tournament. He actually had to drop out of a lot of tournaments that in the past he would have easily won. And the reason for that was the change that comes for all athletes, aging. And he suffered a slew of injuries. And people in the tennis world looked and said, like, aging has finally caught up with Federer. Like, he just can't do it anymore. Uh, Federer, at age 37, went on to have the best season of his career. He won 2 major championships, and he had the best winning percentage of his entire career at age 37. And when you talk to Federer, what he attributes that to is he held on to his sources of ruggedness, his values. So for him, it's competition, excellence, and love of tennis. But how he applied those values had to shift dramatically. So he learned a new backhand to slow down the ball. He started playing at the net more to shorten points. He even got rid of the racket that made him the best in the world in favor of a racket that all these young kids were using with new technology. So he held on to those values. Those didn't change, but then how he practiced them, how he applied them, he had to adapt in the face of aging. And I think when it comes to marriage, when it comes to having kids, when it comes to aging, the nail on the head example I just used, um, we can still hold on. Like we don't have to abandon our sources of ruggedness and go out into the unknown with no compass. We can still have those as a compass. That can give us some confidence, can be a decision-making tool. It can help us. But then the flexibility comes in being really open in how we apply those things. So I think our values, in many ways, it's the ground on which we stand. And as long as we have those and we know those, we can have some comfort. But then we have to be really open in how we apply those things. So it's
Wow.
like know your values and then ask yourself, like, well, what does it mean to role model integrity or respect or health or love or creativity or whatever the value is? And that's going to look very different at different times of life.
So I want to back up here for a second because you keep talking about core values, which by the way, I love. And I think some of the audience, they know the term, but I don't think they know like, well, what does that even mean to me? So in our group coaching environment, our mastermind, one of the things that we take men through in the first 12 weeks of their evolution with us is an exercise to pull out those core values, those 5 to 7 core values, and we have an exercise that helps them disseminate those and all that. So, but I didn't really understand that when I first started doing personal growth. I was like, what do core values have to do with anything? It's a really dumb question now that I think back on it. And now that I know mine, it's insanely easy. And number one, do I know myself better? But it's insanely easy to make really good decisions.
Yeah, you just
Because
ask, like, what would I do? What
yeah,
would the core
it's
values tell me to do?
exactly like literally like a filter to run everything through. I'll give you an example. So like we did this even with our family, my wife and I. Like one of our core values, obviously, health, vitality, environment was a big one, connection. So, let's just take the connection and the environment, right? So we don't spend money on cars because we don't value them. Like they're literally just 4 wheels that hold a ton of goldfish in them. That's how we view our cars, right? However, our home and where we connect as a family, like we're willing to spend a little bit more money there, a little bit more time there because we value those things so much. So like environment, we did a backyard project about a year and a half ago. And it was all, there's a big fire pit back there. There's places for everybody to sit and gather and just enjoy the weather and just be around each other. And that was a very easy decision to make, to spend resources on that because that's where we gather. Now, I think a lot of people like they think they value something, but then they get it and they're like, ah, this doesn't really make me feel better. So like I had a friend of mine up the street. He bought a Corvette. My oldest son was sitting next to me after we got this thing done. He's like, "Hey, Dad, when are you gonna buy a Corvette like so and so's dad?" And I'm like, "You're sitting in my Corvette." And he's like, "What?" And I was like, he's like, and he's looking around. I was like, "You're sitting in my Corvette." He's like, "What do you mean?" I was like, "Well, think about this." I was like, "We have 6 people in our family. Corvette seats 2 people." I was like, I could go out and buy a Corvette, but I don't think that would be the environment that we want, the connection we want, because we're excluding 4 other people. I was like, and plus nobody else. I was like, or we could take the money and spend it on this. And at the time, he had all of his friends over. We had friends over. There's a big thing. We opened it up, and I was like, or we could have this. It's actually cheaper than a Corvette, believe it or not. And he looked around and he's like, I was like, this is where we can connect. This is part of our home. This is where you can have girlfriends and friends and everyone can gather and be together and create memories and conversations that they otherwise wouldn't. Or we could buy a Corvette where it's just me and you driving around. And he like looked around and he was like, good decision. And I think back on that, but there's like that part of me, right? There's that part of me as a dude, like, well, I think I value a Corvette. That'd be kind of cool. I should go out and buy one of those. But then I'd get it and I would know instantly, this wasn't the right move. So I think people think they know their core values, but I don't think they truly know their core values. But for someone who's like, okay, I'm kind of understanding what you guys are talking about, how does someone go out and discover those?
I mean, read my book or join your mastermind group. Uh, Short of that, I think that there's a couple of ways into your core values. One is to think about people that you really respect and you look up to, and then ask yourself, what is it about them that you respect and look up to? And those are probably pretty good core values for you. Another is to imagine yourself 10, 20, 30, 40 years down the road. Like, older, wiser you. You're in your library, you're sipping on bourbon in a nice leather chair. If you don't drink, maybe it's a coffee. And you're looking back on current you. What do you want to be proud of with current you? That's another good road into your core values. Because it can be hard, right? There's like infinite options. So I get that. Um, I think the third way is to ask yourself, like, when you were in high school or in undergrad school, maybe, like, what really made you tick? What were you really curious about? That's another good way into core values. And I think it's important to separate, Skittles from meat and potatoes. And like the Corvette to me is Skittles, it tastes
Yeah.
great. There's nothing wrong with liking Skittles. We all like Skittles. But if your diet's going to be Skittles, you're going to feel like crap. Whereas the backyard, like that's the meat and potatoes, the first bite doesn't taste as good. It takes longer to prepare. It's not as exciting. It's not like in a bright, shiny wrapper. But you have a diet of meat and potatoes and you feel pretty good. So I think kind of holding the candy versus the nourishment on the one hand, and then some of those inroads to your core values can go a long way. But I mean, I'm constantly struggling. Struggling is the wrong word because I have a handle on it, but I'm wrestling with this. Um, so like with this book coming out, there's a section in there that, and I'm very apolitical in my writing. I'd consider myself like, yeah, somewhat left to center, but I'm pretty freaking moderate, insane. But there's a lot about like Donald Trump that I just don't think is very admirable in terms of like what a man ought to be like. And I really went back and forth, like, should I include this in the book or not? And ultimately, I didn't know. I'm like, well, who do I really admire? And the answer is Jason Isbell. I don't know if you're familiar, the Americana, great singer songwriter, Jason Isbell. And part of what I love about Jason Isbell is he just writes his truth. He doesn't care what anyone thinks. He doesn't care if it's going to impact record sales. He's not an asshole about it, but he writes his truth. And I said, all right, like, I think I really value like truth and truth telling. So I'm going to write my truth here. And if I piss some people off, I'm going to piss some people off. It's going to be okay. I'm going to be able to sleep at night. Um, so I think like that's a really good example of looking to someone you admire, saying like, what do I admire about them? And saying, well, then that's the thing I got to do, even if it's hard.
That makes so much sense, man. And I love the Skittles and the meat and the potatoes. That makes an insane amount of sense, to filter, at least if a guy doesn't understand, like, well, how do I really understand what these core values really are? I think that's a really easy way to decipher some of them. Um,
And it comes up in relationships a lot too. A
It
close friend
does.
of mine, won't go into too many details, but like really just like I'd say he's my best friend in the world. So if you like me, you'd love this guy. Emergency room doctor, trauma trained, 6'4", looks like the Hulk, heart of gold, the person that we always call when anything goes wrong, and he is there for us. But really struggled in relationships, and part of it is
Like
probably because he's struggled like forging lasting, close, intimate relationships
so with like
with
a woman
women,
or
with
okay, got
women.
it.
Sorry,
Okay,
with
got it.
women. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. Romantic relationships.
got it.
And part of it is because he is like 6'4", looks like the Hulk, trauma doctor. Uh, and I've tried to help him through this, and like he really had this big breakthrough, and now he's like in a wonderful long term relationship. Like 2 years ago, where like essentially like he kept eating Snickers bars, and like Snickers bars are easy. You just unwrap them, you eat them, and then you kind of like, okay, like that was good. Uh, and in the first bite of like brown rice and broccoli does not taste as good as Snickers bars.
Right.
But if you spend 10, 15 years eating Snickers versus brown rice and broccoli, I can tell you you're going to feel a lot better on the brown rice and broccoli. But you have to get away from the candy. And this is like real. When people struggle with nutrition, like this is what they struggle with. But I think this is true in so many areas of our life. It's true with content. So much of like Twitter, social media, TikTok, Instagram, it's candy. And there's nothing wrong with enjoying a Snickers bar every once in a while. I do, but like it can't be the meat and potatoes of your diet. Reading books, long form conversations like this, it's a lot more fulfilling, but it takes more time, energy, and effort to get into a book or a conversation like this than to scroll social media. So it's
100%.
it's a metaphor that I come back to a lot, which is like, am I doing the candy ultra processed food version of this, or am I doing the real thing? Even if the real thing takes a more upfront effort, I know I'm going to feel better later as a result.
I agree, man. Yeah, the kind of the funny thing you're talking about here is, the long game, right? And things like that. We just went out to dinner with my brother-in-law and his wife and my wife. And I've known them for 27 years. I've known my brother-in-law for 27 years. And, I ordered my food. We went out to this burger place, like kind of like it was higher end burger place. So they had other options there. But I got salmon with rice and extra Brussels sprouts. And he looked at me, he just shook his head. He's like, "Are you ever not on a diet?" And I'm like, I just looked at him, I was like, "Diet?" He's
Just
like,
like,
he's like,
yeah,
"You're always eating like this." I was like, I just kind of laughed. I was like, dude, I was like, I love eating like this. I was like, I wouldn't eat any other way. I was like, he's like, why? He's like, that. I was like, number one, to me, this tastes phenomenal. Number two, if I ate a burger and fries, I would go into a coma afterwards. Like, I just don't feel good mentally, physically. I feel like absolute garbage. Like, I've been eating like this for so long that the good stuff tastes good. It is good. It results in good things. And the junk is just doesn't do it for me. I don't even crave it anymore. But to him, like he couldn't really kind of get past that. Like he just like looked at me like, "What's wrong with you, man? Like you're weird."
I got a funny side story about that. So, and that tracks to your core value of health too. That
Yeah.
like, of course, that's how you're going to eat. Uh, I feel very much the same way. Um, but I live in Western North Carolina. There's a lot of fast food,
Yeah.
and I got a very funny story because I eat pretty good too. But the week my book came out, we're doing this big event in Asheville where I live at the local gym because it's just like a huge part of my community is there. It's a big space. And we had plans that after we're going to go out to dinner or bring in, if it went late, from one of our favorite restaurants to kind of celebrate the book coming out. And the event went long, great turnout. Everyone wanted to talk. So many friends after, and we got to get home because our older one is with us, but he's like, I got to get home. The babysitter's leaving, so we're just gonna go home. The event, there were like some appetizers. We got to take that all, charcuterie, so like cheese and bread. But I don't want to eat just cheese and bread for dinner. So we drove by Burger King, and man, on the freaking sign, 2 for $6 Whoppers. I just like I make a hard left, and Caitlin, my wife's like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "I just
Uh,
got to do it." So
yeah.
I get the 2 for 6 Whoppers. I inhale those things.
Oh my God.
Um, I felt so terrible the next morning. I've done work like psychologically, I'm fine. Like I know I'm healthy, and that's not actually going to kill me, but just physically, it was such a reminder. And now, like, I'm sure it's like a vaccine. Like it'll last for a year, and then I'll need a booster. Like I'll have to eat fast food again to like
Yeah,
re up
yeah.
my antibodies. But like now, I drive by that Burger King, and I just have no no wanting to turn in. Um, but I think like, back, and I tell that partially as a joke, but it's real. It happened. But back to our initial point, I think like, you have to cultivate your taste buds and your digestive system. And if all you're eating is fast food, you're going to get really used to it, and you're going to like it, and that's going to feel normal.
True.
Um, and the flip side is also true. And again, it's like in every area of our life, like junk content, junk food, junk relationships versus the real thing. And the real thing is always harder at first. It always takes more time, energy, and effort, but it is always more fulfilling on the back end.
Do you think that's a good litmus test for, hey, this is a good thing, I probably should keep doing it? That if it's like difficult, kind of hard at first, doesn't feel so good, but it's probably going to result in something good.
100%.
Yeah.
And I think the back half of that is important too. Like I think just doing hard things for the sake of doing hard things, I think there's actually some value in that.
Yeah.
Um, but I think particularly if like the thing's hard because it has a delayed gratification at the back end, it's a good thing to do.
I agree.
It's kind of like vulnerability. I mean, all these pieces tie together, right? Like vulnerability is hard. It takes time, it takes effort, it makes you uncomfortable. It's a lot easier just to like put on that bulletproof vest. Um, but you put on the bulletproof vest, you don't have the deep community and friendships. You're vulnerable, you do.
You literally just took the words right out of my mouth. Minus the really cool analogy of the bulletproof vest thing. I wasn't that creative, but I was like, oh, it's kind of like vulnerability. You're like super uncomfortable to do it, but then right when you do it, it's better. Um, I wanna wrap up here with anything else that you have as far as your message in your book for dads and husbands. And by the way, this has been awesome to
Thank
hear.
you.
Like, and thank you for being malleable, like rugged flexibility, right? To really, because I asked you before we hit record, I was like, is there any way we could really put this through the lens of a man, husband, and father, and the life and the things that we face in that? And you did such a phenomenal job. But was there anything really important left on the table, left unsaid, that you're like, hey man, just these 1 or 2 points that are really important?
I think there's one more point that
Yeah.
is really important, and it comes from the last chapter in the book, which is for really hard negative changes in our lives, oftentimes the only thing to do is just to keep showing up and get through. And I think something that can sometimes happen in personal development books and podcasts and YouTube and whatnot is there's such a focus on having a growth mindset and practicing gratitude and being gritty and growing from pain and suffering. And I think all of those things are true in 98% of circumstances. But sometimes when shit really hits the fan, that's impossible. Like your friend that tragically lost a daughter, like
Right.
telling him, like, oh, well, why don't you just come up with 3 things you're grateful for? Like, that would be the most tone deaf thing to say. And for really bad, hard changes, the ultimate, like, growth hack is to release from the need to grow at all and just get through. Like, sometimes things just suck and it's okay to just let them suck. And if you just keep showing up and getting through, meaning and growth might occur. They're actually likely to occur. The research shows this to be true, but it has to happen on its own time. Like you cannot force meaning and growth. You can bring about meaning and growth from all kinds of smaller changes actively, but for the real big stuff, a shitty health diagnosis, a loss, grief, like you just have to be kind to yourself and keep showing up. And then when you get to the other side of these things, sometimes there's no ever getting to the other side, but when you get closer to the light, that's when the growth and meaning happens. But I think sometimes self-help junkies, they try to put this pressure on themselves to immediately find meaning in the struggle or to grow. And then you essentially take a negative, the terrible thing that happened, and you make it a double negative, because now you're like, well, I can't even do what the self-help books tell me to do. And I think that's a trap that a lot of people fall into.
Can I ask you one more question if you had a minute?
Yeah, I got
Because
time, of course.
because I think this is really good, and it's super important. Because yeah, there are speed bumps, and then there are like, holy crap, I think my car just drove off the cliff. Like,
Right.
these big, massive changes. So, you know, here I am, and I will call my situation, my injury, really minor, like compared to the problems of the world, right? But to me, I'm like, there's a patience aspect, right? Where I j- I do my PT every day. I'm doing everything I need to do, and there's a part of me that when I wake up the next morning, I'm hopeful that everything's fine again. And then as soon as I take that step and I realize, crap, it's another day that I'm struggling through this. I'm trying to be ruggedly flexible, right? And do what I can, not focus on do what I can't. But there's like this patience aspect of mine that I am like, feel like I'm going freaking insane. Like, for the love of God, when can I just be through this? And then I'll take an extreme case. Like, God bless my friend and business partner. Like, I cannot even imagine waking up in the morning being like, oh my God, this pain is still there. But I think for human beings, you mentioned the term delayed gratification, but when we're going through a season of agony, like, there's that patience aspect of like, okay, I get it. I'm trying to get through. I'm trying to show up. But for the love of God, like, how much longer is this going to go on? And I think for that last statement, for the love of God, how much more is this going to go on? What advice would you give somebody where they're having a hard time with that patience?
Ooh, I'm glad you asked this. The advice is to name that that's happening, and then to know that what seems like it is taking forever right now probably won't feel that way 1 year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now.
Oh, that's a
So the
really good point.
ultimate example is clinical depression. Like, a hallmark of depression is it feels like there's no way out, and it feels like it's just forever. Minutes feel like hours, hours feel like days, days feel like years. Uh, but for people that recover from depression, which is the vast majority of people, and get to the other side, they look back on those periods and they don't feel nearly as long. Like, they often just feel like a small speck of time, 5, 10 years down the road. There's this fascinating study in this section of the book that I describe, and I'll do it in brief here because it gets to this point about why patience can be so hard. There's a neuroscientist named David Eagleman that his whole career is studying the perception of time. And he wanted to explore this phenomenon that when we're going through really hard things, it's hard to be patient and feels like it's going to go on forever.
Mm,
So he took study participants to an amusement park in Texas where there's a ride called the SCAD. And essentially, you're just like on a mattress with like kind of a nylon net around you, almost like a trampoline that kids jump on, and you just drop 150 feet. It's like a free fall. And he had participants estimate how long it took to fall while they were on the ride. And then he had them estimate how long it took to fall when they were off on the ground watching other people. And what he found is that when they were on the ride, they overestimated how long it took by about 40%.
really?
So when you're in free fall, time, literally, your perception of time slows down, versus when you're on the ground, when you're off the ride, when you're at the other side of it and you're just watching it, you gauge time accurately. And it's this beautiful metaphor for big changes, because big changes, it feels like we're in free fall. And when we're in free fall, our perception of time slows down. But when we get to the other side of these moments and we look back on them, it doesn't seem like it was that long. So the advice that I have, if it's any consolation, is just with like 1 to 5% of your being, just know that, like, yes, my brain is telling me that this is taking forever and it's going to be like this forever. But if I just keep showing up, and if I just get to the other side of this, one day I'll look back on this and it won't seem that bad. I can almost guarantee that me and you talk 3 years from now, and this period that you're going through with your knee is going to seem like a nothing burger.
Sure.
But when you're in
Wow.
it, it still sucks, and you can
Yeah.
be really kind to yourself. Um, And as Eagleman's experiment showed, like our brain just, man, it's weird. And for the science nerds, the theory behind this, I find this stuff really interesting, is that when we're under threat and a big negative change is a threat, our brains want to view the world in minute detail because they feel like they're under attack. They don't want to miss anything. It's like back to evolution. Like we want to make sure that we see that snake or that mountain lion that could be in the bushes. So we view the world frame by frame. Versus when things are going well, we view the world as a movie, a continuous movie. And I think the two big extremes are like clinical depression, where everything is frame by frame. You overanalyze every thought and every feeling, and time just slows down. Versus when you're in flow, a peak performance state. Time flies. It's like this one continuous flow. So I think having some intellectual knowledge of this can arm you when you're in a shitty situation to name it and to say, hey, this is just my brain slowing things down. I just have to keep showing up.
Oh, Brad, how old are you?
Me?
Yeah.
I'm 37.
Dude, you were like wise beyond your years, man. Like some
Thank
of the
you.
things, yeah, honestly, man, like some of the things you shared today, I'm like, God bless. I mean, I'm 10 years ahead of you, and I'm sitting here thinking, like, I wish I would have known half of these things like 10 years ago. I mean, people probably get to the end of their life and they never hear what we even just talked about in the last 10 minutes here about slowing things down and how it feels like everything's slowed down. We're going through a bad time or a bad season, and they speed back up when we're more in flow state. I mean, just even the intellect around that be like, well, wait, let me step back and just understand from an intellectual standpoint what's actually happening here. Okay, that makes sense. Okay, now I can kind of like I can bob my perception a little bit, or I can evolve my perception a little bit here. Uh, that is incredible advice. And but man, thank you for sharing what you did today. This was really, really good and very
Thanks.
timely, especially for the holidays. I mean, I know that this show is coming out around the holidays, and people tend, things get more stressful. And I know for a lot of people that intensifies around the holidays, and they're probably viewing and experiencing things frame by frame, so this was really meaningful, man. And I want to make sure that I want to give you time here to make sure that everyone can find you, what you're doing. I mean, obviously all your books can be found on Amazon, but where can they connect with you, or best place to go find books from you?
Yeah, thank you so much. And I really appreciate what you said. I think to bring it full circle, one of my core values is intellect. So I try to practice that. And then any wisdom that I might have, I think was earned from 7 years ago, just going through an absolutely terrible clinical depression where I felt like there was no way out. And time did slow down. And I'm so fortunate that I had a great psychiatrist and therapist. But there was no meaning, there was no growth in the middle of that. There was nothing I was grateful for. But I got to the other side of that. And a few years later, looking back on it, there was all of this wisdom that came out of it. So I just try to write what I know intellectually, and then what I know from experience. So you taking note of that means a lot to me. So thank you.
Yeah.
To answer your question, I think the most recent book, Master of Change, is probably my best work yet. So I would recommend that readers start there. Like you said, you can get it wherever you get books. If you like that, then I'd go on to the Practice of Groundedness. It's a good 1-2 punch. On the internet, my website is just my name, www.bradstulberg.com. And the social media platform that I'm the most active on is Instagram, where my handle is also just my name, at Brad Stulberg.
Got it. All right. Well, we're going to have all the links in the show notes for you guys, not to worry. Brad, this was awesome, man. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Yeah, feelings are mutual. Thanks for having me.
You bet.